All right, I hit record and I'm with Joan Lightning, which we were just commenting what a fantastic last name. Yeah, just sparks all over. Um, Joan, thanks for coming on the podcast and giving us work to look at. Talk to us a little bit about where you are in your author journey.
I'm a self-published author. I've been self-publishing since 2016.
Okay.
Uh, Started writing in 2008. I wanted to, and I dived straight in. None of this short story stuff. I dived straight into epic fantasy that was twice as long as Lord of the Rings.
Nice.
So I wanted to finish it before I tried to publish it because I wanted to know I could.
Yeah.
I'm currently doing the sequel to
Okay.
the original story was ended up 7 volumes.
Wow.
This is supposed to be a trilogy, but it looks like it's going to be 4 books now,
Okay.
and one book three. Uh, I work in my spare time. I'm a I'm a professional archaeologist in real life, so I just do
That
a
is
bit.
super cool.
Thanks. So I just work in my spare time, evenings, mornings, just do a bit here and there. I'm what
Nice.
a pantser.
Okay.
Uh, and make it up as I go along, and then cross my fingers and hope it all comes out in the wash. If you know what I mean.
Yeah, yeah. So you feel motivated by the discovery process.
Yes, and sometimes that means then going having to go back and tweak something earlier on in the story, but it usually kind of works.
That's so great. That's really exciting. And I'm sure the archaeology stuff really helps with the epic fantasy too. Those feel aligned.
Yeah, some of it certainly because of the knowledge of older techniques of
Hmm.
yeah, but obviously it's sword and sorcery, epic fantasy, clean, faith based. Uh,
Nice. That's great.
uh,
Yeah.
so
Gotcha.
uh,
So yeah. So you sent me a piece that I want to look at together. What before I dive into like my thoughts on it, what do you really want to like? Is there anything you really want to walk away with today? Any problem you want to solve?
well, this has been a tricky chapter because, as I said, oh yeah, as I said, this is the final chapter of this particular character's arc in this book. It
Okay.
will, it will pick up in the next book. Um, she's an interesting character, and in some ways, I think I've made her at this point. She's got a little bit too shiny, good, and perfect.
Hmm.
Not she shouldn't be quite that good, and she's no experience of romance or anything like that. And in this scene, she's with a guy who's been pursuing her for weeks,
Okay.
and only recently revealed himself to not be what he was portraying a role most of that
Gotcha.
time. He was pretending to be a simpleton. You
Okay.
know, he seemed to have the mental age of about 12,
Yeah.
and constantly following her with puppy eyes and all, and driving her nuts, and calling her by a name which apparently told all of his people that she is his fiance, and he hadn't even asked her. So she kind of punched him a few times when she found
Okay.
out that she's from a warrior race, and recently converted to a different religion. She's her people serve a fairly nasty god, but she's now changed. She's changed a lot over the last couple of books. She's really turned her life around immensely, but she's no experience of romance or anything of that nature. Her people don't do
Hmm.
that. So, but at this point, they've both had a sort of it's a kind of a curse thing that called the Judgment of God. They had a court case. They're both there's a very good chance they're going to die from it.
Okay.
They're not. They're not, obviously, because I'm not
Yeah,
taking
but
off.
they think they are. Yeah.
Yeah, he certainly thinks that he's going to die.
Yeah.
He is actually. She has said a couple of times she has faith that she's been doing what God wanted her to do. Therefore, she's going to be okay.
Okay.
But she still feels this pull. Um, but he's not pretending to be what he is. He's still a bit of a trickster. He's still a prankster. He's still a bit juvenile as far as she's concerned. But at this point, partly thanks to this curse, she's kind of she suddenly during the trial She became
mm,
very, very angry at the way he was being treated, jumped up to defend him, and ended up in the same situation that he's in. Um, and she's not entirely sure why,
mm.
but she's attracted to him. And at this point, she's a bit confused and not entirely sure where she's going with it. I general feeling is that next book, at the end of this one, there's going to be a bit of a something that in the next book he's going to be very embarrassed about, possibly getting some stick from his people because they're all monogamous,
Hmm.
celibate until marriage sort of thing. And I have a feeling from the end of this chapter, he may not be anymore.
Gotcha.
So the next book, there may be some embarrassment on his side.
Gotcha.
But
I love the pantser energy there. Like, I have a feeling this is coming next, which is great. It's
I mean,
fantastic.
I started this in the dialogue and I've been kind of building outwards
Okay.
from to try and add more nuances to it. And when I saw the chance to get it, have you help me with it? Then I thought, great, that may another pair of eyes is always going to be good.
Awesome. Okay. Well, let's break down so there's two sections to it. She's alone in her thoughts in the first section. And then in the second section, he comes out and joins her. And then
Yeah,
there's kind of an ending third section where a dragon joins them as well.
yeah, it's a very
Um,
small.
yeah. Yeah, very small dragon on the ceiling. So I want to actually take it in reverse. And I want to do the dialogue section first, because it's much stronger and you're doing things in the dialogue section I want you to apply to the top. Um, the reflective section where she's by herself reflecting isn't bad. It's good, and you're using this dialogue spacing to keep me engaged. And by that I mean you're writing exposition like it's dialogue. So she's kind of talking to herself here, and you're using italics to like indicate these inner thoughts, which keeps it moving, which is good. Um,
I've in the story. I've actually skipped 2 days,
okay,
um, and that was one of the reasons I was doing some of that recap there because I didn't want to waste too many chapters describing yet another bedroom that she was, yet another new place they were going to be. I thought if I have time, I could maybe come back to that at a future date, but
gotcha.
we skipped a bit.
Okay,
I,
well, let's just start at the top. So you skipped a couple days because now I'm interested. You skip
yeah,
now I want to talk about it. So you skip a couple days and you're like recapping what's happened.
yeah.
She's sneaking out of a party.
It's not exactly a party. It's more as they're expecting rioters in the streets,
Okay,
and so they're in an upper room to just kind of sit it out until the reciters have cleared the rioters away.
okay,
It every evening for a few days.
okay. And I like what you're doing with her voice. So one of the problems I find when writers a lot of times use inner thoughts, especially in italics, like this, is they don't use them enough. So like it's a tool. Once you start using the tool, it's like, well, you want to make it a consistent character in the narrative. You're doing a really great job of that. It's really good. You're keeping that even into the dialogue when we get down into them talking. You do a great job of keeping that inner thought rolling. And I want to say, because I'm going to pull this back up top, the inner thought works is most powerful when you have this. Um, where is it? Here it is. Um, when you have this combination of it, this is when it works best for your character. Sherelle's lips twitched at the last word, and then in italics, maybe the seal pup is learning he cannot make my choices for me. So the pair of the physical response with the inner monologue is really, really strong for this character when you use
Right.
it. And I think as we go through this top part, I want you to pull more of that in. My first thought, though, in the problem with summaries like this, where you're like recapping what's happened that the reader missed, um, when we put them in a character in isolation, thinking about them, they seem less important to the reader.
Right.
because the reader gains energy and feels empowered in the story. Like the reader's pulled into the present moment by character interaction. When characters are interacting, the reader feels like, okay, here I am in this tangible moment. And so is it possible to give us like what I would want is to think like, okay, let's take maybe half of this information. There are things in here that you have to have an internal reflection because she can't talk about them. They're too personal. But some of the details you have here, I would love for you to take those and actually show us the room she's leaving and get some of this out in discussion. Does that make sense?
Right.
How does that
So
feel?
like maybe actually have her in the room, glance over, have some sort of interaction just by their eyes, because obviously Nara's on the other side of the room with
Mhm.
Nara, then kind of maybe she hears some of their conversation, maybe even do that. You mean something like that?
Yeah, I mean,
Like,
like she's standing in the room and there's like, a couple people talking about what's happened over the last few days. She can be listening in. You can use that inner thought as her participation in the conversation. But then a lot of these details of just that are just like what happened, you can get out in that dialogue and it's going to feel stronger to the reader because they're going to feel present in the moment.
so characters in the room actually discussing the fact that these riots are happening because these three people are now with them. Yeah,
Exactly.
I see what you mean. Yeah.
And if you have a character who's kind of a gossip, who's like a big voice, that's the one that I would bring in here. That because what you almost want is like, can you believe that this is happening? Like that over the top voice that's like
I think,
bringing in the kind of
well,
because you're. Oh yeah, go
most
ahead. Sorry.
most of the people in that room haven't been introduced, but it's possible. I mean, John Dee's parents will be in that room, and
Okay.
his uncle might be the person because
Yeah.
his uncle is not approving of what's been happening. He's quite annoyed about it all, so he might be the person to make some complaining about the fact, yeah, we've got riots for another day, and it's all John Dee's fault, sort of.
Perfect. Is there a character that wants to impress the uncle?
Uh, well, no, I haven't really introduced the Kellandrines at this point.
Okay.
Uh, the only ones we've actually met properly have been John Dee's parents and his uncle. Basically, John Dee, Nara, and Shara were picked up by John Dee's parents and uncle, driven across town, taken into this walled enclave.
Okay.
They although they've been escorted, they've met up with an older character, Iodnal, who's basically being held hostage at the moment, much to his
Okay.
annoyance. So haven't really. There are other characters. Yeah, they've been there are some other people there, but they've not been really.
They've not been introduced. Yeah, what I'm looking for, just to give you an idea, is if you've got the uncle, because when you just spoke the uncle's voice there for a second, you
Yeah,
were speaking of him as like the tone you were using was somebody of like reserved power in a sense. He's got some authority, he's got a little gravitas, he's a little grumpy. Um,
yeah.
to get that guy talking, you really need a character that wants to earn his favor. And so if you can find what I call a hazard character a lot, which is a character that doesn't have a major role in the story, but kind of has a big voice, meaning like a kind of one note voice. They're like just anxious, or they're just gossipy, or they're just defined by kind of one characteristic, and throw that character into this room, put him in a conversation with the uncle that she's overhearing. You don't even have to give us a big introduction to them because she's just listening to somebody's conversation, and let that person try to seek the uncle's approval by talking about what's happening outside. And then if you want to make it comical, as in like not comical as in like riotously funny, but comical as in like, oh, there's kind of an edge to this. Have the person trying to earn his approval by talking about how, positive things are, and then says they're negative, and then they're like, oh no, yeah, yes, yes, yeah, it's terrible, right? Like, and get that kind of back and forth going, and that's why you want somebody seeking his approval, because they're going to bend to whatever he says and keep him talking. Does that make sense?
I see. It doesn't necessarily even have to, because I don't want to introduce lots of new characters. Obviously, at this
No,
point, write a new chapter. But I see what you mean. So just she doesn't even have to know who it is, really.
nope. She doesn't even have to know who it is. You just give us like a one. Give it like I could see this chapter being like, give me like a paragraph. It doesn't even need to be a full chapter. Give me like a paragraph describing the room she's in, kind of where she's standing, how she feels about being there. uh, Make sure the reader understands the time skip, right? Like 2 days later, give me that transition sentence.
Yeah.
And then have her kind of see this man like cross the room to speak to this other dignified man. You don't even have to name both of them. Give me like one sentence description of each of them, and then have her kind of be entertained by listening to the conversation. Does that make sense? And then you can even have Jordy, the I think I'm getting his name right, the guy that we're going to see kind of in the romantic entanglement below. You can even have him slip into that conversation, and that's when she can excuse herself and slip out. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah. So at the moment, I've been hinting that basically he disappeared to the loo.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that works too.
Yeah,
Um,
but
you could
yeah,
even show him leaving to go to the loo and then have that conversation start.
yeah,
But that's going to make a lot of this world building that you've got going on, like a lot of the discussion about the different peoples and the riots happening. It's going to make it more entertaining for the reader and make them zone into it a little bit more. um
understood. Yeah, because that first section was kind of a bit of an afterthought. I added that of everything on here. That was actually one of the last things I'd added because I originally had her standing at the window looking out and seeing the riots, and then realized that actually I'd got no sense of where
what's
she'd been,
happening? Yeah.
where she is now.
And it'll
But
make your window scene more, if they're talking about the riots and then she goes and looks at the riots, like she does now, it makes her looking at the riots more tangible.
right,
Which is weird to say that like somebody talking about something makes it more tangible, but it's about reader attention and getting them to actually think this is important. And so
right,
when characters are interacting, like I said, it pulls us into the present moment and makes us feel like we're there. So if you can get these details into that character interaction, the reader's going to pay closer attention to them because they feel present in the moment. Then when she gets to the window and is looking out, I realize as the reader, like, oh, you're describing what they were just talking about in the other room. And it'll allow you to, right now, she's in a descriptive role
yeah,
where there's a summary of text and then a reflective sentence. And her reflective sentences are like, we're the reason for the curfew and the riots, so they will not forget that we're here. Are they never quiet? I must thank her later. This is unwise. So these reflections are going to be used, these like inner thoughts are going to be used better, like more effectively, when they're giving us her perspective on what's happening,
right,
not when she's describing what's happening.
definitely,
So when if you can get other people describing it, it allows you to put her in a position where she's giving the reader like, this is how we should feel about this together.
yeah,
Does that make sense?
yeah. I see what you mean. Yeah, I think I do.
Yeah. um
Have that conversation, and then they start the noisy bit where they're playing the music, and maybe someone starts singing, and that's something again she's not used to.
mhm.
But then move into the are they never quiet?
Oh, and I really like that because if you get her to leave when they start singing, it gives you a really, you have this great paragraph up here about how the floor feels on her feet. One advantage of floors covering with living grass and the flowers was the ability to move silently as she wanted to get as far away from possible to enjoy a few minutes of solitude. It really allows you to contrast the two rooms. And
Yeah,
right now, without seeing the loud room, this room doesn't have that pop. But if you give us the contrast of the two rooms, this room's really going to stand out more. Does that make sense?
I guess you. Yeah.
Yeah. Excuse me one moment. I need to cough and I don't want to do it in the microphone. Dang, sorry. My voice is still warming up this morning, so I'm not. Yeah, I think
I'm,
you're the first person I've had an extended conversation with this today.
I,
So
Yeah, I'm a bit hoarse because I've been doing park run this morning.
Oh, wow.
It was my 250th, so I kind of went all out to try and have a good time, or reasonably good time anyway.
That's
Uh,
fantastic.
uh,
Yeah, congratulations. 250. That's great. Um, yeah, so I think that covers most of my comments up here. Again, I really love your dialogue spacing. I love the like paragraph, and then here you get and this is where it goes really well. Her judgment was certainly impaired. She should stay with the others where they could watch her and stop having any fatal accidents until the judgment of God released her, if it ever did. But she needed to err on the next line. So you have that dialogue spacing where she's like in tension with herself, and you're
yeah,
letting it act as if two people are talking. And then you bring out that inner thought. And I need to think about what happens next.
yeah.
The only other thing we haven't talked about in this first section is I do want you to watch, you're using italics for two different reasons.
Mm,
Sometimes you're emphasizing a word,
yeah,
sometimes it's her inner thought. Right now, it's not in the two instances I caught it in this chapter, it's not too confusing. I'm kind of like, okay, I know what that means. Um, but it is it can seem weird of like, wait, did she think that word and not say it? Does that word supposed to stand out? So down here you use are they never quiet, and you bold and italics the word to stress it. I would do that all the time. So like someone would bold in italics realize that Jizon had slipped away. And if you're going to emphasize words, do it the same way everywhere so that it's like, oh, that means emphasis, just italics means internal. Does that make sense?
yeah. It's been a major problem in this book because I have people speaking in a made-up foreign language.
Oh no. Are they in
Telepathy.
italics too?
Yeah, what I try to do is not mix and match in the same chapter.
Okay.
Because we've got another chapter where there's telepathy, but there's also some internal thought. So I have to try and keep it spaced apart. The telepathy I mark off with stars, as well as
Okay.
yeah, but it has been a bit of a challenge. It has to be said. So this chapter, it's just returned. But yeah, I
Yeah.
definitely get your point about it can be confusing.
It can be confusing, and you don't want, it's one of those things that you don't want a reader to get caught up on. Does that make
Yeah,
sense? Like there's a lot, especially in epic fantasy, there's a lot happening. There's names, there's different races, there's just different places. And you're bringing all of that in here in a really beautiful way. What we don't want the reader to have to process too is, wait,
yeah.
is this telepathy or this? It's not fantasy, but Martha Wells writes a series of books called the Murderbot Diaries. It's sci-fi, but she does something very interesting there because she has different types of communication. She's got communication on an open comm channel in a spaceship. She's got communication on a closed comm just between two people. And then she's got the inner thoughts of her robots. And so something you might want to consider is she brings in brackets and parentheses to
Yeah.
so that she can, and italics, so she can separate the three types of communication. And it allows her, because she's using all three of those tools. So like I don't remember exactly what each one stands for, but like the brackets are communication over the comms, the parentheses are communication in the in like internal, and then the italics, what it allows her to do is use all three forms of communication in a single vocalization. So
I
like, oh yeah, go
yeah.
ahead.
I was I've tried to do something similar with the when people are speaking in Kandaren,
Okay.
whether I've written it in Kandaren or I've written a translation. I've used I think it's a Spanish uh speech marks where
Oh,
it's
nice.
the arrows, two arrows. Is
Gotcha.
it the beginning and end? And I said for the telepath communication, I use stars, a star at beginning and end.
Nice. That works well. And that way, like if you can assign each type of speech a specific thing, and then not use, even if you're using like a different font type, which I'm not a huge fan of, but
Yeah,
even that, because it can look unprofessional if you're not careful with it, but even that allows you to separate these things and not if you can establish a system and stick to the system, it helps the reader not be confused.
That is one issue, though. If I have those characters speaking, they would be speaking in Kandaren,
Mm-hmm.
which would then bring in having to do the punctuation and also
Yeah.
me. Cheryl can understand it, so she would be able to hear it in English, as it were,
Mm,
but they would be speaking. The way I've got it is because they're in Kandar at the moment.
yeah.
Uh, Cheryl can understand Kandaren because of magic, um,
Yeah.
but they speak. All the Kandarans speak English. Well, Rithian,
Yeah.
because it's like Latin used to be
Mm,
in Europe. It's like a universal language that's used for the church.
yeah.
Uh, but they're at home, they would be, where they're speaking between each other, they would be using their own language, which is Kandaren, which would then bring in another set of um it won't be italics because it'll be translated. So
Okay.
yeah, it will just be using the those brackets. I don't know what they're called, arrow keys.
Yeah. 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 I know what
Yeah,
you're talking about. Yeah.
yeah, the double arrow keys. Yeah, so
Yeah.
no, I won't put it in Kandaren. Cheryl just understands it, so that's fine.
Yeah, I think that's better because if she understands it, the reader understands it because we're in her POV. I would, if there's ever a language she doesn't understand, you need a character that's a translator that'll like tell her what everybody's saying. But this, I do, yeah, just a warning of like how you're using italics. Create that system and then stay in that system. Does that
Yeah,
make
yeah.
sense? Here at the end of your reflective paragraph, she has these big paragraphs where she just kind of starts to ramble. Is that part of her character voice?
She gets she has visions. She's a
Okay,
person who starts to get glimpses of it's called gleaning. It's somewhere between word of knowledge, you know what that is, and spider sense and prophecy.
gotcha,
Um, so I mean here at this point that in this book they're starting to wonder what is this prophecy all about, because they know
gotcha.
there's a prophecy called the Restoration, but they
Okay,
don't know anything about it uh, except that title. The Rajondi's people know what it is,
okay,
uh, but she's trying to work out. They suddenly realise, hang on, we don't actually know what this is. What are we working for here? And so that yeah, it has been mentioned a few times at the beginning of the section of the after they've been arrested. They asks John Dee to start talking about what is it, and he
okay,
tells them at that point that the Tyrians are called the Foundation, the Kandari are the Fire, and his people are the Custodians. So
gotcha.
she's reflecting on that. Um, but yeah, it is a thing. I just wanted to be reflecting on it a bit until she's then interrupted by John Dee.
Gotcha. So the interaction here stops with the world around her and it just goes deep into her mind. If these visions are a part of her character voice and as she's having them, she internally is feeling a like rush of anxiety or a rush of energy, this works. I just want in the middle here, as she's going, a like line here that tells me, not in italics, what physically internally is happening to her. Because, like I said, that's when you're using these the best, when she feels something physically and then she has this thought. We need that like call and response or stimulus and response, external stimulus to that internal exposition. So she needs that external stimulus to really land these. Does that make sense? And then you can increase what this does, where she has these paragraphs of thought, or at the bottom down here of the piece where she's got this, you just have this paragraph of her like running on
Yeah,
sentences, which we can talk about more in a second because I do want you to break that up. But what it does is it makes us feel like all of a sudden she's bursting with thought and energy. I need that paralleled by her physicality. Does that make sense?
yeah, I think so.
Okay.
You think about it.
Yeah, it's if you want to do that with her voice, what's happening is the more she thinks about something, the more that starts to build in her, so that finally there's just kind of an explosion of thought. Um,
Right.
it it works. I'm not, she doesn't come off as an anxious character to me, but it does work really well with anxious characters. Because anxiety snowballs that way, like starts rolling down the hill and then just gets bigger and bigger and bigger.
Now she's definitely not an anxious.
Yeah, she doesn't feel that way, but she does feel thoughtful and reflective, and it works that way for them too. If a lot of times thoughtful, reflective characters are not going to have paragraphs like this, it's going to look more like it does up here, where there's like an external stimulus, which right now you're using as a summary, which is why I want you to get a lot of this into that conversation that in the room that she witnesses, but an external stimulus and then a thought, as opposed to like a vocalization or a physical action. That's what makes her feel like a reflective and thoughtful character. Does that make sense?
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
So
I think.
this ends up feeling, with what you're describing about her, these paragraphs of thought end up feeling a little out of character. I might break them up so that they look more like this up here.
Right. Gotcha.
Yeah. Um, okay, let's talk about when he comes into the room. She looks down at the street. This is great. I could use a little more discussion here. Um, where just a little more like insight into what she's seeing. Not a ton, a sentence or two. Right, like in the streets below, lights blazed from glowstones held aloft on poles, illuminating the heads and shoulders of figures swathed in robed clothes. The rumbling cloud ebbed and flowed. This is all really great description. I'm sorry, I'm skipping down a little bit. Um, and then, here, there, reciter's tailspin played soothing music while male cloud feathery urged people to return to their homes. Slowly, the conjuring mob reduced and thinned, too slow a pace for Shale's peace, which is a nice perspective from her. But this is kind of where I need her inner thought. You've got this external stimulus of everything she sees. Give us, you're using her inner thought to give us perspective on how we should feel about it. So go ahead and give us that perspective here. Does that make sense? Just a little touch more. Um, I think to really embrace what's happening in the street. Maybe even add, like, too slow for Shale's peace. Give me her internal feeling, right? Like her gut clenched as she thought about the mob outside, then the internal thought. Or if she doesn't feel that, if her gut's not clenching, like, her heart raced as she considered the mob outside, then
Gotcha.
the inner thought.
Which was what I've got the next line about wanting to leap down there. That's the like I was trying to aim for there, but because she is of a warrior race, um, you've got to. We'd actually just like to get down there with a sword and just deal with it
Nice.
herself. Yeah.
So I would have, like, her skin tingled with desire. I wish I could get down, like, to join them would be ecstasy and inner thought. She wanted to leap down there and make them feel. So this isn't like she wanted to leap down there and make them all flee from her wrath, is not inner physicality.
Right.
And so this is kind of telling me what it is. I To keep it from that, like, you just telling me what's going on in her brain, and to, like, bring me into her perspective, make me feel it. So give me the inner physicality of, like, her palms sweated, or her, the hair stood on her arm, right? Like that, like what she's experiencing, the inner thought, then you can explain it to me. But that brings me as the reader deeper into what's happening here, past just
Yeah.
an explanation. Does that make sense?
I get you. I get you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so here we bring in uh John D. Something you'll notice, not as you do a great job of keeping their back and forths going. There's two things though in this piece that I want you to think about. This is that like building romance between them.
Yeah, which I'm bad at. I'm very bad at.
No, you're not bad at it. It's great. I got what you were doing. I
Good.
think there's two things you're missing. One, we want their utterances, like their vocalization. They're part of the conversation. Where is Jenna? I left her. She will be cross when I return. We want those to be as short as possible
Right.
because it communicates a hesitancy to talk, and it'll at the same time build energy, like tension in your reader when they're passing the hot potato of conversation back and forth quickly.
Yeah.
The other, so that's going to be one of the major notes I leave in here. You'll see as we go through these a piece at a time, you'll see me adding that a lot. Like, hey, let's keep this interaction going. The other thing I want you to think about is their physical position to one another. In these romance scenes, there's a dance. When people show attraction and are kind of giving into the attraction, they move toward each other. When people are trying to deny or push away the attraction, they move away from the partner. So you have this dance where if she's trying to deny it, you do a good job where she's not looking at him. She's keeping her eyes focused outside. But what I want is him progressively moving toward her a
Right.
little bit at a time. And then at the end, when they finally touch, I'm going to talk about how I want more there. But you lose his reaction to her. So, like, she touches his bicep. What does his bicep do? Because there's a like interplay, there's a dance going on between them, and that dance communicates the emotions of the scene as much as their vocalizations do. Does that make sense?
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. So, here, for example, footsteps echoed in the corridor behind her. An answer, there you are. I worried. Jor-El's voice was, of course, but only one set of footsteps. Was he alone? Sherelle did not turn around. The floor is covered in soft grass in the footsteps. I wish not to startle you, so I made a sound. Where's Jenna? I left her. And you had, I left her. She'll be cross when I return. Give me like take advantage of their back and forth. Give me that extra exchange. I left her, have her like smile or whatever she's going to do in response to that. It doesn't need to be vocal necessarily. Like, oh, she won't like that. She'll be cross when I return. Right? Like have them. Another way you can show attraction between characters in these romance scenes is showing agreement in their conversation. So if she says where's Jenna and he says I left her, then have her say she won't like that, and then he can say she will be cross when I return, and that agreement shows that they're like coming together. Does that make sense?
Jenna is his protector. She's supposed to be keeping him safe.
Yeah, it's great. I totally read it that way. It's like the nanny, like where's your nanny following you around,
Yeah.
and but it's the like adding that little extra exchange brings a ton more energy into what you're doing,
Yeah.
and
Okay.
communicates like, oh, these characters are pulling toward one another. Now here you have Sherelle smiled, and then you gave me like a paragraph of a couple, well, really just a long sentence of like removing me of exposition, where you remove me from the situation and you like tell me about something. Then you give me an inner thought, and then we have this line. You should not leave Jenna, she said. If anyone can keep you safe, it's her. And then he talks about him, about who he is to her. So the segment break, the change in conversation is when he says a child stays safe. This line, you should not leave Jenna, she said, if anyone can keep you safe, it's her, is actually the ending of this little conversation they're having about his approaching her and where Jenna is and the fact that he's alone.
Right.
So ideally, we want to create moments of connection and presence for the reader, where the reader feels present in the scene. We want to give the reader a full moment before we pull out and give exposition. We need to pull out and give exposition to give the reader a moment to breathe and to
Right.
reflect, but we don't want to break our moments. So take this line, you should not leave Jenna if anyone keep you safe, it's her, and go ahead and drop it up here before the exposition.
Right.
And
Okay.
then jump into the him coming back into the conversation. Does that make sense? And it seems like a small thing, but what it's going to do is create this kind of very fun moment for the reader, where the reader, in an undistracted way, feels like they're present in the moment. And then we pull back to reflect in this paragraph with the inner thought. And then we go back present into another moment. And it's
Yeah.
going to create an intimacy with the book that you want. It's what keeps readers like reading to the end, especially with epic fantasy, where like this book is going to be long. So you want them reading to the end. And it's these moments of intimacy that you want to make that happen. Does that make sense?
Yeah. That's
Here's
you.
a here's a place when he says, so we move into the next segment. He says, a child stays safe, but you're not interested in children. You expect courage. He took a step toward her.
Yeah.
Give me the dance, right? Like he took a step toward her. Children can be brave as adults and can be afraid. It was not your lack of courage that made me think of you as a child. I know it was my thoughtlessness, my unconsidering, my fun. Some was the part I played, but not the rest. The rest of it is who you are. They're trickster. And then here you tell me where she is, right? She still hadn't moved, but you don't tell me where he is.
Right.
You don't give me the full dance. So have her say this, they're trickster, and then give him maybe one more line here, like trickster, right? He considered the word and took another step toward her, right? Like moving in that like dance together as they're like coming emotionally together. We want them coming physically together too. Does that make sense?
The
and
trick.
then and then we're at the end of another segment, and we can have this here. You put the paragraph break in the perfect spot, right? Because he's going to say like, or she's going to come back and say, I once told Rovi. So she starts talking about something else. This is the perfect segment break. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Any thoughts or questions on that? I'm dumping a lot on you at once. I apologize.
Yeah. That's with trickster, because that is what he's called by the rioters. He's kind of like Loki, the trickster god.
How does he feel about that name?
Oh, he's loved it. He's loved it all his life. It's only
Okay.
now, suddenly it's been a bit of a problem. Maybe if he says trickster, but not your trickster, or
Yeah,
that's not what.
that's perfect. Trickster, but not your trickster, he said as he took a step toward her again.
Right.
Right. But we want that like physical movement toward her and her still hesitancy looking out the window. Right. Like, so you communicate their attraction through that physical dance with each other.
Right. Gotcha.
And I know you're writing clean, but if you do write a love scene, it's the buildup of that physical dance toward one another that makes the like actual embrace climactic. Does that make sense? It's the like movement. Um, yeah, anyway, I'm just going on and on. Uh, you'll notice I cut yes. A lot of times they say yes. We don't usually say that. And it's one of those cheap things that we can cut from dialogue to keep that dialogue snappy. It's a dirty trick. Um, this is that we already talked about this, but this is that perfect use of inner voice. Sherelle's lip twitched at the last word, and then she thinks maybe a seal pup is learning. That's a great, like, this is great use of that external stimulus or like physical stimulus to internal thought. Really great. You have a big paragraph. She says a lot here. And then we go into this paragraph where she then speaks again. Let him comment in between, because we want to keep that energy between where they're passing that ball back and forth between them. It doesn't need to be a lot. It doesn't need to add any content. He just needs to like either I would have him agree in some way with what she says. like even if he doesn't believe it. They run around shouting about magic and evil. They think we're sharks in their ocean, never considering that if we were, they would already be cooking on spits. Just have him be like, so true. Because it's the agreement between them that communicates he's moving in here. Does that make sense?
Gotcha.
Okay, so here we get the dragon. What is the impact? We've had this romantic build where tension is building. She's still looking out the window. He's moving toward her in conversation and physically. And then all of a sudden, she notices a dragon here who's going to save the day in a minute. What is the impact of the dragon on the emotional tone of this room?
Hmm. I probably should have mentioned him. I did forget to mention it earlier, I think, that the dragon's with him. The dragon is able to help keep him safe. As you see what happens later in the scene, the dragon has some interesting properties. So
Yeah.
it's but the dragons are quite small and
Okay.
they're very intelligent. So I mean, as far as Cheryl's concerned at this point, the dragon is probably no more than a pet.
Okay.
He doesn't really know.
So the way right now, it just in this section only, you have the dragon interacting as a character,
Yeah.
right? So, we encourage this is him talking. We encourage a different sight, but please come away from the window. It's not safe for either of us. A croning whistle supplemented his plea. Cheryl glanced at the little dragon clinging to the ceiling above them. I will not wrap myself in blankets from the Lord of Light, she told the cold dragon. So she speaks to it. If he wants me dead, he can reach me wherever I go. The animal whistled and chirped at her. So you're suddenly in a three-person conversation, a three-character conversation, a big, what I call a big cast conversation. And now you have to balance all three of those people, or one of them has to get out of the room. And the problem is the romantic intimacy that's possible in a one-on-one isn't as easy in a big cast conversation because you have to balance this observer who's there.
Would it be better if she actually just addresses John Dee right there rather than the dragon, just notices the dragon there, but doesn't interact with it until it then saves him from
It
falling through
depends. It depends on how you use the dragon in other scenes. Do they interact with the dragon in other scenes? Do they often talk to them? Does the dragon respond like this?
That's a good question. In this thing, the dragon was introduced briefly in the previous chapter,
Okay.
but thinking about him in the final section of this book, another couple of characters encounter a similar dragon, and in that one, there is a lot more. There's a lot of interaction between that dragon, and those characters as that section carries on.
Gotcha.
I could ease back of it on here because I don't want to give too much away about the dragons in this bit. So I
Okay.
may give too much about it there. I want the dragon to save John Dee from falling through the window,
Yeah.
but it would be better if she wasn't. She still at this point doesn't realize that it's quite what it is.
Okay. So here's what I would do. And the reason I'm pausing to talk about this is because you want this to be able to build an intimacy between them, where at the end they're actually having this romantic moment. In order to do that, we have to get the dragon out of the room. So you're using the dragons a little like in sci-fi they use droids, where they're characters, they have voices, they have personalities, but they don't actually vocally communicate all the time. So um what I would do is when she recognizes that he's there early on, let me know the dragon is here
Right.
right away. This becomes a three-person conversation right away. In the segment breaks in between the two, like right here where we were talking about he's going to respond to her saying, Trickster, take another step toward her. tell me how she is, and then just have her notice the dragon still humming in the ceiling, right? Because you have to acknowledge that third character in the room. The dragon can then save him. Um, and then right here, like, the dragon kind of makes this window reappear and saves him. Have him thank the dragon and then excuse it. And have him say, like, hey, can you give us a minute alone? And let the dragon leave. And now you've got your intimacy between the two of them. Does that make sense?
All right. Okay. Yeah.
And if you make it a 3-person conversation, the two of them and the dragon at the beginning, when he asks the dragon to leave, it gives this sense of like, oh, this is important now. It's just the two of them.
Right. I see what you mean. Yeah.
And it builds that togetherness. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I see what you mean. Yeah. Yes, it
Yeah.
does.
And I think that's going to help. But I would say, as you're writing, whenever there's a dragon in the scene, you have to think of them as a full character. They
Right.
need
Yeah.
full response engagement in the segments. We need to know where they are and what they're doing as the reader. Like they need to be included as if there's another person in the room. And they're going to change the tone of the room, right? Like the room is different when there's 3 people than when there's 2. And so just knowing like that's there, getting them out of there when you want to have intimacy is going to be important. Um, you can even, if you want to make it bigger than it is, you can even have the dragon kind of like huff and protest, and then him be like, just a minute. And then it can like scamper off to the other room. Um, yeah, here's, you start here losing. Well, so sorry, not yet. So here's another place where she actually, would be a great place to get rid of this dragon. But she says, did you do that to the animal? She moved me to a different, he responds, you got to give me the animal response.
Right.
He responds, you got to give me the animal response. This is a 3-person conversation. So we've got to get the snappiness between all 3 of them. And that's going to bring this dragon's personality out. How the dragon's responding, even though the dragon's not speaking, like in Star Wars with R2-D2, it's going to bring that personality forward. She has again an inner thought here based on this. He says this, and because she loves me, she saves me. The word love is kind of an important thing here. I'd give her again a physical response of like she feels something physically. And then what did he mean by move to another path? Maybe that's linked. And then give her maybe a statement of intent of like why she cares about that thing. Um, Again, in italics to be like, just continue the thought a little bit. But again, I want that external or like physical stimulus to drive the internal thought. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. Um,
Hmm.
and again, here we kind of lose the dance. So he speaks, she thinks, his physicality. He speaks. He moved toward her again. He was close enough to her now that she could feel his presence behind her, right? Like start building that. I would rather live with Sherelle built off that sentence, and then you just had her picking back up. You should not fasten your courage on me. Let him respond. He doesn't have to speak. Like I would rather live with Sherelle bit off at the end of that sentence, right? He leaned in. You should not fasten your courage on me. You should need other supplies, she said instead. Does that make sense? Like giving that like physical movement provides a lot of that dance. Sorry, excuse me. She changes the subject here. She has this moment where she kind of surprises herself, where she thinks melded together him and me. And then you comment on the thought. And then, but all the way down here, you give me you return to this moment of intimacy. So again, you're breaking the segment. This line, he is one of three who may become father of my child, is with this melded together, him and me. It's part of that segment up here. So take
Yeah.
this line and pull it back up here. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Again, to give the reader these encapsulated moments of like, this is all one moment. Um, how does that feel?
Yeah, I think I actually had it there earlier, but and had moved it. But yeah,
Okay.
yeah, that's
Yeah.
kind of like prophecy from a few days earlier, when she discovered that actually he might be the father of her child or
Okay.
next.
Um, she here changes the subject. Does the spell affect other things? She asks him. It removes the sense that lets us see danger, it lessens our confidence because it does other self-restraints. She has this moment of like inner vulnerability where she's like, oh, this might be my man. And then she's changing the subject. Give me the physicality of her moving away from him in some way.
The thing is, I don't feel that as changing the subject. It's possibly there's a bit missing there that she's just suddenly thinking, hang on, this I don't normally behave like this. I don't relate to guys like this. Something has changed. Is it the spell? Is the spell affecting how I'm reacting to this guy?
Yeah, and when I say changing the subject, I don't mean that she's like talking about a brand new topic. I mean the emotional subject.
Right.
She's having a moment of vulnerability here, and it's a nice dance because the next move, if you had continued on the same path, should be her moving toward him, exploring these feelings about who is this guy to me. But instead, she questions her feelings. That's that change I'm talking about. So give me the physicality to show the questioning. Have her take a step back. And again, it's that watching them move together. He's moving forward, she's moving back. He's going to need to pursue her in the conversation. Does that make sense? So give me the physical stasis where she kind of leans away from him. She can look back out the window. She can look down and kind of step away for a second, generating more space between them, but use their how they're standing with each other to communicate that she's pulling away from these inner emotions she's having. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
It's
when you
really,
get into an intimate, it's important, I think, for us as writers to remember that when we get into an intimate moment like this, what they say is important, but how the reader is experiencing the feelings between the two of them is what actually is what the reader wants. It's the like payoff of being present in these dialogue conversations is that the reader gets to feel that moment. So give them everything they need to like feel that dance. Um, the back and forth here is good. You give me here like this is a place where she's physically pulling away. Sherelle pointed her face again now to the empty road. She's turning away from him. She's like creating emotional distance, but studied the man from the side of her eyes. But she's still connecting, right? Like, so you've got a great line here of expressing that like emotional distance, but a longing to stay connected to this thing. No trembling in his voice had been firm if he was afraid he did it well. The only remaining sign was his occasional mistake, speaking Raytheon. You know, this is a nice metaphor you've got going on here about ice melting. Now we're going to lean in fully to the romance between them because you pay it off down here at the end
yeah.
where she's like touching his arm. And so this is originally you had removed the back and forth and you just had her like speaking in paragraphs. Because we're leaning in emotionally, we want more back and forth, not less.
Okay.
So it starts here when she returns to the thought that they might have a future together. He may become the father of my child. This is a path I could walk. So now she's kind of surrendering and accepting the emotions of the moment. The choice felt right. It's great. And then you give me the physicality. She smiled and linked her arm through his. I no longer feel any urge to jump out the window, she announced. How does he physically respond? Does he pull her tight? That's kind of what I would want. Like she links his arm through his, he pulled her arm in closer, right? Like get them closer. And then she can say, let's go somewhere private where where you can explain about cold dragons and what happened just right now. Give him a response. And then she squeezed his arm, feeling the solid muscles under his sleeve. What's his response to squeezing his? Does he flex? Because that tells us something about him, right? Like if you touch a guy and when you touch the guy, he flexes, it tells us that he's a little cocky and he like wants you to know how strong he is, right?
That doesn't describe John Dee. I wouldn't call him cocky at all.
Yeah, no, I wouldn't either, but I'm just giving an example of how like his response communicates to us what's going on. But if she's like, she squeezed his arm, feeling the solid muscles of his sleeve, he reached up and touched her hand, right? Like that, you can feel the like dance between them growing. Um, the new pull was stronger now. His physical response is going to give the external stimulus for her inner thought. She then speaks again. I want to know about your people, John D, about you. Let him speak. Her physical feeling and inner thought about how this is building is needed here. And then let her talk again. At this point, you have two conversations happening. You have the words she's saying and the
Yeah.
emotional dance they're doing. And the words she's saying are kind of out of sync with the emotional dance they're doing, but that's okay. That's part of what we love about these scenes is that it creates the like intimate tension between them and that they're both feeling something. You're showing it physically in the dance, but they're talking about something else, indicating that like we're not fully going to give in to these physical attractions yet. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Um, and then keep her, and you'll notice I'm giving her some pickup words here, like, well, so, and then she talks about this thing, and then have him like, well, and he laughed to himself, formula of answer. And then her physical feeling, inner thought also is like what those pickup words do is they show some hesitancy in that, like, we really want to be talking about something else. But this is what we're talking about because this is appropriate and this is what's supposed to happen. Like, I can't tell you how many like conversations like this I've seen and had as like a teenager growing up in a church where you're not supposed to get physical with somebody. So you're like kind of fighting that urge and still like holding hands and talking about whatever else you can talk about to not give in to like what you actually want to do. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Yeah. So giving her these kind of hesitancy words shows that like I'm going to keep this conversation going, even though I'd really like to talk about how you might be the father of my babies someday, right? Like it's that like um self-denial that builds the expectation for the reader. Um I think those are all the thought. Anything else you want to talk about with the piece? We covered a lot.
Yeah, I think a lot of that is very good because one of the things I have worried about is having her change too fast, too much. But having a lot of this more built into it, all of these physical feelings, could cover that, I think, to actually help bring that across, I hope.
I think your pace of her changing is great. I think I want you to bring the reader along in that change a little bit more by adding that physical dance between them. And it's going to create some great, like, romantic tension at the end.
I mean, I think at some point, possibly he should maybe just worry she's going to hit him, given how often she's hit him in recent weeks.
Maybe that's in his POV, though. And I don't think so. You have him here. He plays the nice role of the strong, I wouldn't necessarily say confident, but he plays the nice role of the like self-assured guy making his move. And I think that plays really nicely. I wouldn't change him in that. He's kind of the stalwart, self-assured guy making his move, which is what in the end is attracting her to him, is his self-assuredness.
The thing is that may conflict a bit with the previous chapter, where when they found themselves in danger, when they were arrested, they were facing execution. And that bit, part of that's when he starts to change towards him. Is at that point he had never faced danger before, never faced
Mm,
death, and he's actually very frightened. He's terrified, and she's the one who then helps him find his courage. And part of the way she does that is by telling him, if I choose a man, he's going to have shown he's brave. Um, I don't want.
yeah, I think are they in the end getting together?
Yes,
Okay.
he is going to be the father of her child.
Okay.
Whether she gets pregnant in the next book is another is I haven't worked that one out yet,
Yeah.
but the idea is that the two of them are long term would be getting together and fulfilling a few prophecies after the books are finished.
Yeah, I think so. Him being scared in danger and him being a normally self-assured person aren't in conflict with each other. But my question is his personality in standard self-assured?
Generally, yeah, he's
Okay.
generally when he's not in danger, he's been cocky, he's been confident that he can handle any problems.
Yeah.
The only he ended up terrified was because he was in a situation where he had no power, no agency, hadn't expected to be there, hadn't expected to be in danger, and wasn't didn't actually expect to survive.
Yeah. So that's fine. You need something that attracts her to him. And if he's a wimp in the danger scene, there needs to be something that makes her go, I like this guy. I see him as a partner. Does that make sense? So you almost need him self-assured here. I might add a conversation about what happened at the
Right.
beginning, at the start
Yeah.
of this. I might add a conversation where he explains that was a new experience for me. And she says something, and then he says, compliments her strength and elevates her a little bit in a way that he's self-assured, not in like a doting, like, oh my gosh, you were so amazing, but like a like stronger, like, I was impressed by your courage. I hope I can model that more in the future. And that kind of honesty and vulnerability will draw her into him and set this scene up better.
Possibly at the point where they did actually mention when she says to him, "You should not build your courage on me." The bit where he has that so it's about growing it from the seeds she gave him.
Yeah, and I'd probably do that right before. I'd have him be vulnerable before she says something. You want him initiating that conversation.
Right. Okay.
Um, because again, we're trying to build a like, why this guy?
Yeah.
Why this? And so if he's vulnerable and open, that seems like a good partner. Does that make
Okay.
sense? So you want to get him vulnerable and open at the beginning of this so that it seeds way for the attraction to lead in. Um, the reason I was asking if this is a love triangle or if there's another person is because this is also kind of a trope type scene where the guy who's cowardly a second ago is trying to cover it up by coming in now and being like, you and me, baby. That's not the character you're writing. So I wouldn't, if that were the character you're writing, I'd be like, well, you need another guy who's actually the love interest. But this is that's not what you're doing. So I would make him vulnerable and open at the top to show so that he puts himself in an emotional place of danger here as an expression of courage. Does that make sense?
Yeah. That I think that does make sense.
Yeah. And that'll allow her to see him differently than the person who's afraid and danger if he does that up front.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. And the reader. It'll allow the reader to see him differently.
And that's actually, that could follow through into what happens earlier, because he, at the end of the previous chapter, he was healed.
Mm,
He'd injured, he had magical healing. And I have established that when they have magical healing, they often have to sleep for a very long time. So this could actually be that it's the first day, the first
nice.
evening he's been up and around and she's had a chance to speak to him. So that
Yeah,
could be a chance for him to then come and say that I really want to thank you for what you did for me.
that's great. I love that. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that works.
Yeah, that works. And that's that honest authenticity that will be attractive in his personality. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, anything else you wanted to talk about with the piece?
No, I think that covers an awful lot. Will you send me these extra comments that you've made on it? If
Yep,
you've made on,
I'll send the comments and I'll also send you a copy of the video.
that would be
Um,
great. Thanks very much. I
yeah.
think I've got work to do on this, but no, it's been really helpful.
Oh,
Thank you very much.
good.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and
well, let me stop the recording and we can talk a little bit more.
right, okay.